This is the book Winchee, Mission Stories of Colin and Melva Winch by S Ross Goldstone. The true adventures of missionary pilots and nurses in the South Pacific, as retold to the children of Watertown SDA Church. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go! Today's chapter is called Held Aloft in Angels' Hands. It was a cool, crisp Highland morning. Colin, Melva, and their 4 children, Carrie, Carol, Nerily, and small son Chris, were based at Kainantu, a small town exactly 1 mile high in the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea. For some weeks, Colin had been planning to fly over the Kuku Mountains to drop bags of welfare clothing into each of the 12 villages in the area. This was to be the day. As part of the plan, a request had been sent to each resident missionary to prepare a list of the elderly, young children, and babies in each village so appropriate clothing could be packed into each wheat bag to meet the needs of those most vulnerable, such as those suffering from lung infections due to the cold nights experienced in the highlands. Once filled, each bag was sewn up with the name of the village printed in large letters near the top. These bags had been loaded into the Cessna 180 after removing the center and back seats, as well as removing the passenger side door. This was done to make it easier to drop the bag from the plane. Experience had shown that trying to eject the bags through the window was problematic due to the critical timing of the drops. Colin waited for a New Guinea teacher to arrive who had agreed to sit in the air-conditioned seat and dispense the bags. Apparently his courage had deserted him, so the teacher failed to turn up. Colin then went searching for Oeva, the groundsman of the Kainantu mission station, who had been pestering Colin for months to take a ride in the airplane. When asked if he would like the opportunity to get his first ride in the airplane, he answered by jumping on the front seat of the Land Rover, beaming from ear to ear until he noticed the missing door of the Cessna in the back. Colin parked the vehicle near the airplane and walked over to the plane to check the load was secure. Then he turned to speak to Oeva and saw Oeva hightailing it back up the road to the mission station. His excitement had disappeared when he saw the gaping doorway in the side of the plane. But it wasn't possible for the pilot to both fly the plane and eject the bags simultaneously. A second person had to be involved. After a considerable amount of pleading, Oeva agreed to assist even though he was aware they'd be flying into the feared Kuku country. He was from a village on the edge of the Kuku Mountains, and his people were afraid of those small warriors who were feared throughout Papua New Guinea because they had the reputation of eating their enemies. What if Pastor Winnis, which is how he said Pastor Winch, decided to land on the airstrip in the middle of cannibal country? Would I be eaten? He asked. It took much courage to put aside his fears. Colin helped Oeva up into the ventilated seat, securing the safety harness around him. They practiced the ejection process a few times to be sure Oeva understood what was required. He was asked if he was okay, and he replied, "Me ready. I am ready." After one last check at the plane and a prayer for God's protection, the propeller made a half turn, and the engine burst into life. La-A Control was notified by radio of the flight into the Kuku Mountains as the Cessna taxied down the runway. Little did either of the men realize that the angels had begun their care at that moment. The throb of the engine and the wind rush from the propeller roared in the cabin, startling Oeva, causing him to lean heavily against the pilot. Colin gave him a gentle jab in the ribs to straighten him up, explaining that no pilot could fly a plane with a passenger leaning on top of him. Being his first flight, Oeva had no comprehension of the power of wind. He was to experience even greater noise and the force of the disturbed air. As the throttle was pulled full open at the end of the airstrip, the blast caused eddies of dust to rise off the cockpit floor and from the bags. Again, Oeva shrank from the fury of the blast and leaned heavily on Colin. But a gentle dig in the ribs from Colin's elbow reminded him to sit up straight. Gathering speed down the runway, the Cessna 180 lifted into the clear morning air, glistening in the sun as it clawed its way into the sky with its heavy load. The destination was to the south, so the first turn was to the right. As the plane banked, Oeva was hanging in his safety harness, looking with unrestricted view down through the open doorway. He screamed at the top of his voice. Startled, Colin thought he had panicked, but this was not the case. Down below was the Highlands Highway, on which a moving jeep could be seen, and Oeva had spotted some of his friends on board and was yelling for them to look up at me. In his excitement, Oeva pushed his hand out into the airstream to wave to them, only to have it slapped into the side of the doorway by the force of the wind. Giving his hand a rub, he wondered what it was that had the power to force his hand like that. This was all such a new experience for him. Having climbed into the cold air at 10,000 feet to clear the Marawaka Gap, Colin throttled back a little and descended into the warmer Marawaka Valley. The throttle was to be a vital part of the day's flying, but Colin was totally unaware that he was using a time bomb. He noted out of the corner of his eye that Oeva was tentatively extending his arm out of the plane, playing with the slipstream, also totally unaware that at any second, his life could end. The missionaries in each village had been advised the drop would be on this day, and all villagers had been told to retreat to their houses when the mission plane flew over. While every attempt was made for an accurate drop, this didn't always occur. On one occasion, a bag had crashed right through the leaf roof of a jungle house. Fortunately, the occupants had not been injured. To carry out the exercise successfully, there needed to be precise timing between the pilot and the one ejecting the bags. Colin made frequent use of the throttle to warn the residents of the impending drop by revving the engine, then throttling back as the plane descended, and with full flaps down, slowing to the point of the drop before accelerating again as it climbed and proceeded over the ridge to the next village. This procedure was followed over all 12 villages, opening and closing the throttle numerous times. Colin was totally unaware that a serious problem was imminent. The task was successfully completed. Colin waggled the wings in farewell and returned to Kainantu, where he again used the throttle to rev the engine to alert Melva that he was home, then closed the throttle at 500 feet and coasted down for a landing with Oeva grinning from ear to ear. What a story he had to tell his village mates that night around the fire. A few days later, Eddie Piez, Secretary-Treasurer of the Papua New Guinea Union Mission, was planning to take a commercial flight to Mount Hagen. On hearing this, Colin suggested, hey, a savings could be made if Eddie chose to join him in his flying activities on that day. Colin was to fly from Lae to Usarumpia to pick up an American volunteer missionary and his wife, Bill and Joyce Cochran, who had been sharing the gospel in remote villages in the Kuku Mountains. They were to be taken to Kainantu, and then the flight would continue on to Karamui before making the final leg into Mount Hagen, which is where Mr. Eddie needed to go. Eddie happily agreed to the suggestion, realizing he would save funds and at the same time see some of the remote highlands areas. Following prayer for a safe flight, they left Lae, observing that the mountains in their direction of travel were unusually clear. Clear skies sometimes heralded strong winds, and this proved true as they approached Usarumpia. The Usarumpia airstrip is on the side of a mountain. It is reached by flying down the Marawaka Valley, then turning right into a smaller offshoot valley, on the side of which is the airstrip with bush-clad mountains close by on either side. Once the last half of the final approach is reached, there's no turning back. It is either land or crash. There is not enough space to turn around in the valley. The short strip is on a steep incline, varying from 10 to 16 degrees with a level turning platform at the top. Taking over the controls, Colin made the approach in strong crosswinds. Once the wheels settled on the ground, he opened the throttle, increasing power to make the incline to where the passengers were waiting, together with many local people. Eddie marveled that anyone would consider making a landing strip in such formidable surroundings. Following, loading, and another prayer for safety, the group turned and took off down the steep slope and became airborne in time to look down on the sheer drop into the valley below. In flight, Colin and Eddie discussed the twin-engine Aztec plane donated by the Quiet Hour in America being converted to Australian standards at Ayura. They decided to drop in and see how the work was progressing on that plane. Again, the landing was made in strong crosswinds, but Colin was experienced in such conditions and used the throttle extensively to counter the winds. After a brief stay, they took off for the 2-minute flight to Kainantu. The Cessna 180 is a dual-control aeroplane. The wild winds buffeted the plane, necessitating Colin having control, though Eddie had his hands on the dual co-pilot controls, which gave him the sense of flying the plane as a prevention of air sickness. The plane was positioned for final approach, and Eddie was asked to lower the flaps and check that the throttle was closed. It wasn't. Something was drastically wrong. Colin noted that they were overshooting slightly. He took control and managed to land the plane safely, rolling past the taxiway. After an initial check of the problem, they exited the aeroplane and pushed it back into the parking bay. On checking further, Colin found the throttle cable had worn so badly that it had been only hanging by a thread. It had finally snapped sometime on that short 2-minute flight into Kainantu. The flying conditions on that day had necessitated an extensive use of the throttle. If it had broken on the approach to or the takeoff from Usarumpia and the mountainside landing strip, it would have meant certain death. But it broke on approach to landing in Kainantu. If it had broken while Colin and Oeva were dropping bags, they would have crashed in Kuku territory, but it had not. Both men gave thanks as they considered the day's use of the throttle. The Lord's everlasting arms were certainly underneath them that day. Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book Winchee by S Ross Goldstone, which is available at the Adventist Book Center. And meanwhile, check out these videos and others on my channel, with many more mission stories and Bible skits for kids and adults. God bless you.